Hi everyone! Lately I've had a few emails of people asking me about heat embossing. How is it done? What types of inks do you need to use? What's the difference between the different embossing powders? So I thought I'd put together a series of tutorials and to explain the basics of heat embossing, share some tips with you, and also some more advanced techniques that you can do once you've mastered the basics of heat embossing. Heat embossing is a really fun technique, and it can add some really spectacular effects to your scrapbooking and your cards and just all kinds of craft projects. So first, a basic description of what heat embossing is if you're not familiar with it. Heat embossing is when you apply what we call embossing powders over an image that has been stamped or a surface that has been inked. And then you apply heat to the powder and it actually melts and it creates like a glossy raised effect on the surface. Here's a card here that has some heat embossed elements to it. If you can see, I'm going to shift it here so hopefully the light will reflect off that haunted house there, but you can see it has like a glossy effect, and if you could reach out and touch it you could feel that it actually has been raised from the surface. This little witch here and the moon are also heat embossed on this card. So you can see it's a really neat effect. So in this video, first video, I'm going to share with you some basic supplies that you're going to need, how to do basic heat embossing, share a few tips with you, and then from this video we'll move on to some more advanced techniques and also some projects that involve other materials besides cardstock for heat embossing. It's a great, fabulous technique, and I know you're going to love it. For basic heat embossing, you're just going to need a few tools. You're going to need your embossing powders, of course, some pigment ink, and a heat tool. And then, of course, you know, your cardstock or whatever it is that you're going to be embossing. So let's start by talking about the inks. What you need is essentially a slow-drying ink, and that's why we use pigment inks. You can use a Versamark ink. It's a very sticky ink. It's a watermark ink, but you can use it for heat embossing, or you can actually use a pigment ink. There's lots of different ones on the market. Stampin' Up's pigment ink is called craft ink, but you need to be sure, like it says here, that it's a pigment ink because it's slow drying and it's sticky and it's going to hold that powder in place while you heat it. Now, pigment inks come in stamp pads. They also come in markers like this Versamark marker, which is pretty cool because you can write something and then you can emboss it. And it also comes in applicator bottles, you know, just like this, and it has an applicator on the end. I find these kind of messy to work with, so I prefer to use pigment inks on pads. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about embossing powders. Embossing powders come in a whole variety of colors and with different qualities. There's all different colors of embossing ink. There's metallics, there's white, there's black, there's detailed fine embossing powder, which is great for images that have really fine parts to them. And there's also an ultra thick embossing powder. Stampin' Up's ultra thick embossing powder is called Glossy Glaze. And it will become evident as I go through these different techniques why there's so many different kinds of powders. But we'll go into that a little bit later. Okay, and then you're going to need this heating tool. Now, a heating tool is essential because some people say, well, why can't I use a hair dryer? Well, a hair dryer just doesn't get hot enough, and it's going to end up blowing all your powder off your surface before you actually, the embossing powder begins to melt. So, this is a heating tool that we sell in the Stampin' Up catalog. There's lots of different ones on the market. Here's an older one that I had from years ago, and it has a metal tip on it, which was, it got very, very hot, or it gets very, very hot when you use it, and I can tell you I burned myself more than a few times with this. So I really like this one because it does get hot too, but as you can see, the metal part is covered, so it eliminates some burns. Okay, so you're going to need a heating tool. I think I've covered everything. So let me show you a basic demonstration of heat embossing. Now, like I said, this heating tool gets very hot, so I like to protect my work surface because it can actually scorch your work surface if you're not careful. So I like to use this non-stick craft sheet. And the first thing you're going to do, well, actually, let me show you something else. I've got another neat little tool here. It's called an embossing buddy. And if you live in a place where there's lots of, right now we're having Santa Ana winds in California, so there's a lot of static in the air. And what this does is you rub it over your cardstock or whatever it is that you're going to emboss, and it eliminates the static off of it so that your embossing powder doesn't just cling to everything. Okay, and the next thing you're going to do is you're going to actually stamp your image on here. And I'm going to use this image that's from the 5th Avenue floral stamp set in the current catalog. You're just going to stamp that with your pigment ink. Okay, and then we're going to apply our embossing powder next. This is another tool that you might want to invest in if you're doing a lot of heat embossing. It makes it easier for cleanup. It's called a powder pail. I can't say that. A powder pail. Pal. That's what it's called. Anyway, it holds the excess powder when you apply the embossing powder in this tray, and then it has this little cap on the end, and you just take that off, and then you're able to pour it back into your container of embossing powder. But if you don't have one of those, just a simple piece of paper with a crease down the middle will work. And you're going to put that on there, and let me get some, I guess I'll just use this black embossing powder. Okay. And you're going to just shake your embossing powder over the top and be very generous with it. Don't worry about it, because all that stuff that doesn't stick, we're going to put back into our container, so there will be no waste. And as you can see here, there's some, even when I use that embossing buddy, there's still some little stray pieces that stuck to the other parts, not the image. And so you just brush that off, or you can use your breath and blow it off, but just, or use a, paintbrush and brush it off, okay? And then this, you can just pour back into your container. Okay, so there's no loss. Okay, so this is ready to heat. If you're working with a small piece, you might want to hold it with tweezers. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to give my heat gun, I'm going to turn it on and give it a few minutes, or a few seconds actually, to heat up before I put it towards my image. That way I'm not blowing any of the powder off the image before it gets hot enough to actually melt the embossing powder. So you're going to start at one end of your image, and this may not be easy to see on the camera, but you're going to just hold it like 2 to 3 inches from your image, and it also depends on what kind of cardstock you're using. Some cardstocks, especially glossy cardstock, tends to scorch, so you don't want to hold it too close. But as you hold it, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this on the camera, but you'll begin to see the embossing powder melt, and it gets, shiny, or it gets a little darker, so you can tell that it's melted. And as it melts, you're just going to move your heating tool over the rest of the image until it all